In this video, I will be spending 100 real days working on my indie game. I'm making the game in Unity, and I will be starting from nothing and building a game of a unique fusion of turn-based RPG strategy and action RPG combat. So get ready because this will be quite the journey. Day 1. So I started this journey way back, on October 27th, 2021. And yeah, that is way longer than 100 days ago. But the 100 days that I have recorded in this video are only ones where I've worked on the game. And I started out not working on it very often. But this first day, I started out by just putting together some basic top-down movement as well as some simple sprites. Then I built an attack system. This attack system is taking heavy inspiration from a game called Archvale, and I'm using a similar style of animation, with the sword swinging back and forth and also creating a projectile. And even though it was only the first day of development, I decided to add some screen shake whenever you attack, just to make it a bit more satisfying. Finally, I also made a peace state for the player, where you move slower, don't have weapons, and have your other two party members following you. It was a very productive first day. On the second day, I decided that I would do some more polishing, despite the fact that I have practically nothing in the game to polish yet. But anyways, I added this running animation to each party member, and also made them spawn some dust particles when running. I made sure to be careful to make every single part of the game self-contained, so the dust particles were created by their own script, which means that I can attach them to things in the future that aren't just the player, like enemies or NPCs. This is a game development technique called future-proofing, where you waste a lot of time now, so that you can maybe avoid wasting a bit of time in the future, but at least it makes your code look pretty. But on this day, I also did some planning. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to make a battle system that combined turn-based combat with action combat, but what does that mean exactly? I spent a while, even before beginning development, brainstorming what this could be. I started out with complicated systems where you switch between controlling multiple players and go through menus while battling, but I eventually decided that this was all a bit too complicated, both for my brain to program and for incoming players to the game. Rule 1 of game dev is to assume all of your players are idiots, so I made it as simple as possible. There are two states in each battle, a fight state and an act state. In the fight state, you attack enemies and you dodge bullets. And in the act state, you use actions and items to buff, heal, or do other things that will help you in the battle state. It ended up basically being like Undertale, but whenever you're in the bullet hell state, you are also dealing damage to the enemy. Day 3. If you couldn't tell from the previous day, I wasn't really sure what tasks to tackle next at this point, so I put aside a little time to make a Trello board for the game, which I still use now, over a year later in development. So after laying out all of the upcoming tasks, I decided to focus on allowing you to switch between party members, and also making each of these party members have individual weapons. So I got the member switching working, with the animators changing and a variable storing who's leading the party. And then I went up setting about a workflow for me to be able to quickly make unique weapons for the player. I used Unity's scriptable object feature, which allows you to make classes that store values. And this one stores all the parameters and make each weapon unique, like the projectile that it makes, how fast it attacks, its animator, and who uses the weapon. I'm going to use these later in order to make weapons for each character. Day 4. There was actually a month-long break in between day 3 and 4, and that was because I'm lazy. But actually, I'm not working on this RPG as my main project right now, as I am still deep in development for my game Couch Combat. I'm basically just working on this RPG project for a break every once in a while. But I also came up with a temporary project name for the game at this time, Project Seaborn. So progress in the game will definitely be slow at first, as I'll mostly be focusing on something else. But after I complete Couch Combat, I'm going to shift to this being my primary game. But anyways, on day 4, I got the scriptable objects working with the attack script, and then I built the first weapon for my ranged character. A bow and arrow. The bow and arrow fires rapidly and has a lot of squash and stretch with the animation. I'm not planning on sticking very closely to any retro style with this game. I just want a pixel art style, so that means lots of squash and stretch and some other modern touches. I also threw together a weapon for the magic wielding party member, a potion which you throw and it creates an area of effect on the ground. It's pretty janky, but also the most unique weapon in the game so far. And I finished off day 4 by adding in the base for the first enemy with his beautiful sprite and setting up a system so the enemy could take damage. Day 5, I made a battle manager that changes between combat and peace depending if there are any enemies in the room. But then the computer blue screened and I gave up for the day. Day 6, I made it possible to go between different scenes. Then I realized that this probably wouldn't be needed for a long time, but whatever. So I moved on to making the action menu. This is the turn-based side of the game, where you can use actions to inflict different effects on enemies and player characters. I built out the menu, which yes is absolutely final for the game, and I'll be keeping the beautiful default Unity UI assets. Then I set up a scriptable object base for the acts. Acts are built out of a list of effects like healing, damage, status effects, or buffs. I'm only going to make damage and healing right now, but I'll get to the others in the future. Acts also have a type of target that they can aim at, like only being able to aim at the self, only at enemies, only at the player, or being able to hit all enemies or all players at once. And the other part of the axe system that I made was the targeting system that uses these targets and lets you switch between them. And the next day, I made it so you can actually apply these axe effects to targeted instances for heal and damage. And I also made it possible to actually exit the action menu. Day 8, I did a bit of planning. I had already decided that since the game will be set on an island which you crash land on, it makes sense that the first area will be on the beaches. However, I wanted a more interesting idea for the first setting than just beach. I think that a good way to come up with a good idea for an area is to combine two ideas. So I combined the themes of beaches with autumn. I figured that this would be fairly unique and give a good color palette. I don't know if it's actually possible for beaches to have autumn, as most of them just have palm trees. But I guess this beach is special. Day 9. Now that I have an idea for the theme, I figured I would try making some environmental art. But I gave up on that pretty quickly. At this point in time, my pixel art skills were really bad, especially with environmental art. So instead, I did some more work on the battle system, making the UI automatically populate with your equipped axe. And also, I gave each player character an action. Most of them are just cloned right now to make sure it would work, but I'll make real ones eventually. But now, I'm going to switch to making a real enemy to fight. And I would also like to give enemies actions that they can use in the axe state. Have you ever Googled yourself and were shocked to see your personal information exposed on one of those public listing sites? It's a lot easier to have your data stolen than you might think, and data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers, and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live. That's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they make it super hard to do. So let Aura handle that for you. You can try Aura free for 2 weeks using my link, but Aura also does so much more to protect you and your family from online threats that you can't see. It's really easy to set up, so you don't have to download several different apps to get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. You get everything at one affordable price. Let Aura do the hard work at keeping you safe online, so you can focus on other tasks like making games with peace of mind. If you don't want to let people continue to exploit and profit off your private information, you can go to my link aura.com/levin to start your 2-week free trial. This is also linked below in the description. Thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video. Day 10. I started off by spriting and animating the first enemy. I actually came up with some ideas for enemies a little while ago, whenever I planned out the area. They're all fish themed and they're pretty much all puns. The first one I made is the Dapper Snapper, who is a crab with a top hat. I pixeled him out. Looking back, this sprite is disgusting, but I guess I liked it back then. I guess it's true that only a mother could love that face. And I also animated it. Then I set up a basic movement script where the Dapper Snapper will move towards the player if it has a line of sight. The plan is to make it pathfind towards the player if it loses line of sight. But I really don't want to program pathfinding myself, so I looked online and found an A-star pathfinding solution for Unity, which seems to work well enough, so I'll use it. Day 11 was a short one, as I just made some pixel art for 2 of the other planned enemies. Pixel art which probably was not good, and I lost it, so you don't have to look at it. The next day, I got the pathfinding solution sort of working. I just used the built-in movement script that the pathfinding solution came with, and this resulted in the movement speed not being the exact same as the normal movement, so I'll have to fix that soon. But now I'm going to make attacks for the enemy. I thought about how I would go about doing this for a while, before realizing that it would probably be best to, once again, use scriptable objects. I made these objects hold a list of the portions of each enemy's attack, just like how the player's axe work. Each attack has a few properties, like how many projectiles it shoots, those individual projectiles attributes, and stuff like that. Putting all these attributes together, I figured that I could build out many types of attacks for the enemies. And finally, I set up a basic attack controller for the enemies that chooses a random attack scriptable objects from a list of attacks. And now I just have to make it perform it. Day 13, I added more functionality to the attack scriptable objects, mostly making different types of attacks, like projectile attacks, which is what 90% of the attacks will be after all. This is a bullet hell. And I'm also planning on adding movement attacks. And I also made it so you can combine multiple attack scriptable objects to make an attack. This means that in the same attack, you can both move and shoot. And finally, I got to actually performing the projectile attacks. And after just a few more hours, I had the most simple imaginable attack in the game, making a single bullet. This seemingly took a very long time for such a small result, but this system should be robust enough to expand to make lots more complex attacks in the future. And I also made it so that walls destroy bullets, and I made the enemies only attack whenever they have line of sight with the players. The next day, I fixed the issue with the movement speed being inconsistent, and I also set up animation for the enemy walking and made a hit effect for when the player or enemy gets hurt. And now you can actually battle enemies. The battles are totally functional, but unfortunately that's about all they are. So my next goal is to make them fun. I didn't do anything concrete the next day, but I began to think about what the hooks of this game should be. Having a unique battle system should help, and I know that lots of people are looking for bullet hell RPGs as this genre has begun to become quite popular after games like Archvale and Terraria, but there aren't many on the market yet. But I want the art for my game to stand out a bit more, and after seeing an interesting post on Reddit, I had an idea. Well, more accurately, I stole an idea. I wanted to mix pixel art with 3D graphics in a way comparable to Pokemon Black and White, or sort of like Octopath Traveler. Basically, the gameplay will still be 2D, but the world will be 3D, making some objects have more depth and perspective. And I think that this will make the game stand out a bit more in comparison to the competition. And on day 16, I looked more into this change in art style and also made much more UI. It's super ugly and placeholder, but it tells you about HP and stuff that you need to know. And the next day, I made even more UI, this time showing the selected player with these beautiful icons. And I also allowed you to change the active player and the act menu as well as during combat. Then I made a central player input script, as I had been messily getting input in each different script, so it's centralized now. And I got the Trello board set up for the next stage of development. On day 18, I began the switch from 2D to 3D. I basically switched from 2D rendering to 3D rendering and tried to get the sprites to have shadows, but this didn't really work out. In fact, for some reason, nothing had shadows, not even 3D objects. I guess I messed this up in the render pipeline somewhere. I was planning on making big changes in the game to move it into 2.5D at this point. But then I got sidetracked with Couch Combat again, and I didn't come back for months. But over this gap, I did a bunch of thinking and testing. For instance, I tested out one of the unique weapons ideas I had in a little game jam. The weapon idea was a baseball bat and ball. If you hit an enemy with a ball, then it comes back to the bat, and you can hit it again. And the goal is to build up a combo which increases speed and damage of the ball. But after releasing Couch Combat, I realized that I didn't want to work in 3D anymore, as 2D was just a bit nicer, especially for animation and world design. So I decided to drop the 2.5D idea and just focus on the important parts of the game. But I still had an idea for a somewhat unique art style, blending pixel art with some HD hand-drawn portraits and UI, kinda like Celeste. But that was still very far out, and I needed to focus on getting the core gameplay built. On day 19, I began setting up a Milanote board for the game. Milanote is a project planning board, but it's different from Trello, as Trello is more task focused and Milanote is more about concepts and game design planning. But basically, this Milanote board will serve as my design document from now on, where I put plans for story, gameplay, and content for the game. And finally, on day 20, it was time to start for real. Couch Combat was out. I figured that I would just pick up where I left off, moving the game back to 2D and improving the art. And this is what I did for day 21 and 22 as well. And over these 3 days, I worked hard and fast and got absolutely nothing done. I was just building on cobbled together foundations and getting nowhere. So, on day 23, I started over. Well, not really. I started a new Unity project from scratch, but I'll be speedrunning making all of the early systems again. I'll take code from the original project, but will also be more thorough and focused for the better idea that I have of the game now. So it really shouldn't take too long to get back to where I was with the old project. Well, too long in game dev time, so like a couple of weeks. Dang, game development takes forever. So I made movement real quick and then made the weapon attacking system. This time adding a little bit of extra movement to the weapon after you attack, which looks a bit better. The next day I only had 30 minutes to work, but with those 30 minutes I added a dash to your movement options. The dash works by checking your current move velocity, normalizing the vector and multiplying it by a dash speed value, and then adding that to your rigid body. This works well, and overall I'm happy with the dash. Day 25, I added an enemy which you can deal damage to, and then I got to remaking all the other enemy sprites. This time, I decided to make enemies a more versatile class, so I renamed them to fighters, and these fighters can also be on the player's team, enemy team, or neutral. So I can use them as friendly fighters that help you, or I can make them only get aggressive against whoever harms them. Then I set up a battle manager singleton, which keeps a list of all the fighters on the enemy team, and I also set up a main controller script for the fighters. I also made a class called Instance Controller, which both the player controller and the fighter controller classes inherit from, so they can share default functions and values like taking damage. Finally, I did a little work on making the new player sprites. I'm increasing the pixel size for most things in the game, as having more pixels makes it easier for me to add more detail and also makes animation so much easier. Day 26, I made player party member management. Basically, I made it so you can switch characters and also that each character has their own weapons and HP. Don't ask me how you can magically change between different people, I don't have a good lore reason for that. It's just video game logic. Then I set up the second player weapon, Yuri's bow. This went smoothly, so I added a walking animation and some screen shake. And by walking animation, I mean I rotated the sprite side to side. I plan on making some real walking animations later, but for now, this looks beautiful. On day 27, I got hit flashback into the game. which is also part of the instance controller class now. So after I implemented it, it instantly worked for both the player and the fighters, which was very convenient. I also added damage numbers that pop up whenever anything takes damage, and also set up a simple tweening component, which I can use for things like these damage numbers. And on this day, I added some randomness to damage dealt, and I also made Ava's weapon. This time, instead of making a janky potion which you throw, I instead made a Tome of Fire, which rapidly fires seeking fireballs. And this marks the completion of the basic battle system. So it's time to make some proper enemies to battle. But before I got too far ahead of myself, I finally made a source control repo for the game. Always practice safe game development, kids. The next day, I made basic enemy movement. I figured that I could mess with pathfinding later, so I just made it move directly towards the player, which will work just fine in most situations. I then made a new static class. I've been trying to use these more often, as they let you make reusable custom functions that lots of scripts can use. So I made a static class called Fighter Utilities, which I plan to fill with functions for fighters to use. And the first one of these was called Find Nearest Target, which finds the nearest instance controller script that is on the opposite team that the user is on. So now fighter controllers can find their targets regardless of their teams. And I also set up collision damage whenever it bumps you or another fighter on a different team. So I can already have some basic fights between teams of fighters, which is quite a bit of fun. And I also set up knockback for instances, which ended up being pretty buggy, but I fixed it eventually. And finally, I made it so that if a fighter gets attacked by something, it switches its target to whatever it just got attacked by. Day 29 was another 30 minutes day, so I just started on making projectile attacks for the enemies, mostly just moving over scripts from the old version of the game, and I continued with doing that on day 30. And now I have some basic melee and ranged enemies, and I proceeded to spend way too much time orchestrating battles between these two basic enemy types. I'll have to make some sort of army battle mode in the game or something, because this is fun. But day 31, I added some health bars to the enemies and also fixed some bugs with the player's weapon which have been bothering me. The next day is whenever I began to focus on the turn-based part of the game, which is what I decided to call the plan state. And the other state is now called the battle state. That should make the functions of these two states a bit more obvious than act state and, well, not act state. I set up a few C-sharp events with the battle controller. This will let objects of the player and all fighters easily subscribe to events that get called when things like entering combat or the plan state happen. And this is all part of my effort to make it more easy and clean for me to build on all the systems that I have, as C-sharp events make references between scripts much cleaner and more efficient. Day 33, I began to set up the plan state menu. This part of the game honestly changed very little from the old version of the game, and so I was able to bring over most of the code I had in the old project to the new one. So I worked on this into the next day, and the only real change I decided to make was making the energy shared across characters like in Deltarune. I'm not sure if this will be final, but I think it kinda makes sense. I don't plan on making it so that you use Axe on every single character every turn. So now most turns can just be spent charging mana so that you can use it with Axe, and in turn I'll make these Axe very powerful. Then I made the first action, and while I was at it, I figured that I'd make a new system alongside this first act: buffs and debuffs. These buffs and debuffs can affect stats like attack, defense, elemental defense, and speed. And I worked into the next day on this buff handler. Each instance has these, and when calculating things like taking and dealing damage, these buffs are considered. And I continued setting up the instance buff controller system on day 35. Buffs are stored in structs, which are basically just classes that hold values for organization. And then I set up all these functions for adding and removing buffs and debuffs. And with this buff system completed, I was able to make the first act. It's for Liam, and it is called Sharpened Sword, and it just increases the physical attack of the player. Day 36, I added an individual party member HP. They had been sharing it up to this point, but I decided to split it up now. Spoiler alert, this will not be the last time I change my mind about this. Day 37, I decided to go back and rework the targeting system. Basically, I ripped it out of the act menu script, shoved it into its own little script, and then cleaned up the mangled remains of its body until its tangled guts worked again. It was a very visceral act of programming, and now I can use the target selection script with items as well as acts in the plan state. And I also added the ability for it to multi-target. Finally, I made buffs and debuffs also work on enemies, which was pretty simple because once again, they are all built on the same instance controller script as the player. On day 38, I had the idea of overhauling the simple damage number systems to make it a bit more versatile. So I renamed it to Event Exclamations, and I made it so you can control the color of the numbers, and also allowed for words as well as numbers. So now it can be used for simple notifications, like whenever an instance gets set on fire or whatever. But I also decided to add even more info into this increasingly disgusting UI. And then on day 39, something dawned on me. I had added a system of stat buffs and debuffs without adding stats. This was incredibly stupid, so I decided to go back and add stats to instances. I also tied these stats to dealing damage, taking damage, and movement, as well as working with the buff and debuff system. Reworking all these systems that I built accidentally completely incorrectly ended up being one of the most complicated things I have done in the game as of yet. And honestly, I do not want to talk about it anymore, so moving on. Day 40, I decided that the game needed another complicated system that would require a lot of thinking and effort on my part. I guess I was just feeling masochistic. Status effects, like being set on fire, or bleeding out, or even slightly less life-threatening things like just being angry. And so I got to building the system, but for some reason it seems like my computer had a status effect on it as well. Is it blue screens not once but twice this day. Despite that, I made the base for status effects, and I also began making it possible for the player to inflict them with axe. The next day I fixed some bugs and also made it possible for status effects to tick and to stack. I continued on the system on day 42 by building the first proper status effect, fire. Fire deals damage over time, but it doesn't stack, and it can be spread from touching or being attacked by an instance that is on fire. In order to do this, I needed to make both player and fighter attacks be able to spread status effects. And whenever I did this, I couldn't help but notice how much similar and copy code there is with all the different ways of attacking. So I decided to take some time and I standardized the attack values into one class that everything can use. From the player's plans and projectiles to the enemy's projectiles and collision damage. And then I also added status effects to this class. And now the fire status effect is complete. Plus now I can make weapons spread status effects. And day 43 I decided to make it so you can only change characters during the plan state, as I figured it might add more strategy to the game. Day 44 I made player acts able to add status effects to the weapons, and to test it out, I made Liam an act called Serrate Blade, where he adds the currently unfinished bleed debuff to his sword. And the next day I added some visual effects to the fire. And I brought back the ability to change party members during battle. This will definitely not be the last time I change that either, as I'm pretty indecisive when it comes to these core gameplay systems. But day 46, I moved collision damage and collision knockback to its own script, and then I added it to the player. Although the player doesn't deal collision damage by default, this lets it spread fire if the player is on fire. And I also fixed some bugs with knockback. Day 47 was more bug fixing and bug making, and on day 48 I finished the bleeding status effect. It's pretty simple as it just stacks and deals physical damage over time. And it also got a particle effect. And on day 49, I decided to finally face a big problem that I've been ignoring with the game. Currently, systems like taking damage, status effects, buffs, and mana are all managed in different, separate ways. This is an issue as it overcomplicates the individual systems. So I need to come up with a solution that works smoothly. So I came up with 3 possible solutions. I could simplify these things, combining all player healths into one, and also basically treating switching players in combat like switching weapons, and also make stats effects affect all party members and buffs also affect all party members, plus I can make it so you can't freely change characters during combat. And the second solution is the opposite. There are 3 party members and they are separate. You can't switch between them in combat, you have to do that in peace or during the plan states, and they each have separate buffs, status effects, and health bars. And the final solution is somewhat like Delta Rune, where enemies target one party member during the combat stage, and that party member is the only one that takes damage. But I ultimately decided on System 1, as I felt it suited the game the best, so I made it into one shared health bar and shared all the status effects and buffs. Plus I decided to switch out the placeholder name of mana, which was energy, with something that I thought was a bit more thematically relevant, focus. And yeah, so now that I made all these changes, I should have a pretty good final system in place that I don't have to change in the future. Right? And on day 50, now that the status effects and stats are finished, I decided to start to create the first real enemy. I was going to upgrade the old Dapper Snapper, but I decided to make a new enemy idea that I had instead. Introducing the Slow Roller. It's a snail with a slot machine for a shell that deals cards. Each of these cards does something different based on its face value. The number cards each explode into bullets, the amount of which is based on their number. The Jack moves in a sine wave, the Queen leaves behind a trail of bullets, and the King is big and goes through walls. And the Ace seeks the player. So I made a sprite for it, made it walk, made it attack in 2 different attacks, and then made a state machine for the animations to work. Then I set up all the attacks using the system I made for enemies, and I also set up the unique behavior for the cards. Although I only got the behavior for the number cards done. I have not coded the face cards yet. But day 51, I fixed bugs and coded all the face cards' behavior. And day 52, I did more polish with the enemy. And then I got to making the second attack. Since the first attack just shoots 1 card at the player, I figured I'd make a more powerful second attack based on poker. And so the attack is called the Straight. It spins around and deals 5 cards in a straight, which means all these cards are in sequential rank. And I had to make some more custom behaviors, this time for the Slow Roller itself, in order to make this attack be able to work and have the cards go in rank. But after a little bit more work on day 53, it works. Now you can fight the first real enemy. And the Slow Roller is pretty difficult. They can create tons of bullets thanks to the number cards, and the unique behaviors of the face cards also add a lot of unpredictability to its attacks. I'll see how it fits into the game later on, as it might be good to simplify it a bit if it's a bit too frustrating to fight against. But for now it's fine, as it adds a bit more challenge to the game. And I also figured that I would try out a new system, the enemy interaction system. Basically, it's kind of like the axe from Deltarune, where you can do little mini games to interact with enemies. For the soul roller, I figured that it would be fun if you could play a hand of blackjack and get buffed if you win, or debuffed if you lost. So I spent a while making the general system for enemy interaction, and then I coded a little blackjack game. But by the next day of development, I was having some doubts. This system was super complicated, and I didn't think that it would really add that much to the enemy fights. Plus, it's kind of a weird thing to be focusing on this early into development, so I shelved it for now. And instead, I decided to focus on making the current parts of the game that I have in as fun as possible. First off, I made it so that all fighters will have a random delay whenever they start, so that they aren't all just attacking at once at the beginning and synced up for the rest of it. And I also made each enemy attack slower and have less HP. This is so that I can have lots more weaker enemies than just a few tanks, which is generally more fun as bullet sponges are just not fun to fight against. And I also made some walk cycles and added them to the game, but they suck. It's only up and down and they look bad, so I'm going to come back to this later. Day 55, and continuing on making the game more fun, I added corpses that spawn whenever you kill an enemy, because corpses are fun. They are simple rigid bodies that just get thrown around, and I also finally made the dash make you go for bullets. And I figured that now was as good a time as ever to make another enemy. More enemy variety should make battles more fun, and so I decided to bring back our old friend, the Dapper Snapper. However, the old sprite is kinda creepy, so I spent a while updating it, and I ended up with a style that more so matches the style of the rest of the game and also looks just about 10 times better. The next day, I animated a new sprite for the Dapper Snapper, making a walk animation and some attack animation, and I also fixed some bugs to the attack randomizer. I want the Dapper Snapper to have a new sort of attack, a movement attack. All attacks up to now have just spawned projectiles, but the movement attack will move the fighter and also modify their collision damage. And the next day, I made some environmental art, and this time it's a lot better. And day 58, I messed around with possibly making a component for instances that lets me shake them inside animations, as I thought this might be a nice effect. But I couldn't get this to work in a way I liked, so I put it on the back burner as it might be a good idea to work on this again in the future. But instead I decided to put all this new environmental art into the game. And the majority of it is destructible objects, as I figured adding them would make the world a bit more lively and fun to explore. So I made them get destroyed by just disabling the sprite and using a particle system that spawns different parts of the sprites at random and then pauses itself. And I spent hours and hours polishing this and trying to get it feeling right, but I just really could not get it to feel all that great. So once again, I moved my focus. This time to getting the tile set I had just made to work. And after a little while, I can now place down waves of Unity's auto tiling system. Day 59, I made a new tile set, walls of grass on them, and then I put them into the game, and in my opinion, they look great. And day 60, I kept polishing up the tile sets, fixing any holes or seams in them, and I also started animating the waves. And I continue animating into the next day. And after finishing the waves, I think they were absolutely worth the huge amount of time they took to animate, as they made the scene look so much more alive. But after that, I just remembered that I had a half-finished enemy that I needed to make. So I set up a simple animation for the melee attack. Day 62, I made a new system for movement attacks of the fighters. These attacks temporarily override the normal movement for fighters and can move in set directions or directions relative to the fighter's current target. And then I used this system to make the Dapper Snapper's dash attack, and now it all works. At this point, I think that I had succeeded in largely improving the bullet hell side of the combat. However, being sucked into the plant state every 10 seconds or so was getting really annoying, so I needed to fix that. And day 63, I just started by slightly improving the sands by adding dots to it, and then combing over all the other tile sets and cleaning them up a little bit more. And I also added one last tile set. This time, a simple one. It's darker paths in the sand, just to add a bit more variety and direction to it. But at this point, I decided to go back to making some new movement animations for the player. And I'm going all out. No longer just up and down animations, not even just 4-directional animations. 8-direction animations look the best. So that's what I went with. I followed a tutorial to make a basic template for facing in these 8 directions, which are actually just 5 direction because you can flip the canvas for the other 3. And for the next 4 days, all the way up to day 67, I worked on one thing and one thing only, animating the 8-direction movement. And yeah, this took forever. It was a ton of frames of movement, and getting all of Liam's clothing, especially legs and shoes, to bend without looking too messy was tough, but I ultimately managed to get it all done. In day 68, I put it into the game, and I also added dust particles, as I had forgotten to port them over from the old build of the game. This time, instead of having an animation component play on it, since it was literally just switching the sprites on the timer, I set up a very basic script that allows me to have basic sprite sheet animation for objects without needing an animation component or an animator component. Probably only a slight improvement to performance, but it might be worth it if I have tons of objects animating in the future. So I'll probably reuse it in the future for some animated pieces of the environment and stuff like that. In day 69, I made 8 direction animations for the dash. Well, really, I just took the first frame of the running in each direction, and then I made it white and squashed and stretched it in the direction of the dash. And while I was at it, I added a bunch of dust particles to the dash, and now it feels so much better because of it. I finished up by just building out a little map to run around and battle in, and I ended up spending a bit of time just running around it. The game is far from beautiful right now, but the 8 direction movement and the polish of the dash have gone a long way towards making the game feel polished and fun to control. Day 70, I decided to mess with how you enter the plan state, as currently it is mostly an annoyance, so I decided to just make entering the plan state optional, with a little window popping up to ask you if you want to enter it. So now you have a bit more power over the flow of battle. However, I think it also makes sense to make going into plan state mandatory in bosses and mini-bosses, as that should work more with their attacks, stages, and dialogue, and that it should also make you feel like they have the power over the flow of combat now. But I'll do that in the future whenever I add bosses. For now, I added a brief wait after attacks for all enemies, and I also made the Dapper Snapper's dash have a much longer windup to make it a little bit easier to see coming and dodge. And then I also decided to make some slight upgrades to the UI, and also I decided to make it so you can only change characters whenever you start the plan state. Yeah, I changed it again. Day 71, I completed the UI for changing characters in the plan state, and also added individual HP bars to the plan state, because yes, I also brought back individual party member health buff and status effects. I continued to be very indecisive, but day 72, I started animating the second party member's 8-directional run, just getting his new design and idle pose finalized, alongside 8 directions of idle animation. Day 73, I decided to work on something new. I figured it would be interesting if each player weapon could have a unique act tied to it, and so I decided to make a system for these weapon techniques, as I decided to call them. So I set up a ton of structure in the code to allow me to make these acts tied to weapons, and also allow acts to be much more unique, with custom scripts and behaviors. And I decided to make this first technique one for the katana. Whenever you use it, you lose your ability to attack temporarily, but then you have to avoid damage for 10 seconds, and if you don't take damage, then you deal massive damage to all enemies. The next day, I did a bit of work on Yuri's running animations. On day 75, I did even more animation for the run cycle, but then I got the katana's weapon technique to work. Then I decided to properly split the peace and combat states of the game, so I made a peace state where your other party members follow you around and you can't attack. And then I set up the basics of entering battle and switching between peace and combat with these battle zone containers that hold enemies. The next day, I did more work on running animations. And then I got it so that you can now exit battle and go back to peace so there are no enemies left. Day 77, I decided to switch my focus back onto the katana weapon technique. I decided that maybe a technique that incentivizes you to hide in a corner for 10 seconds maybe isn't the best. So I made it that you instead have to dash through enemies. And then at the end of the 10 seconds, the more times that you dash through enemies, the more damage it does to all the enemies. And I also properly set up some UI that showed the countdown. I also started setting up an attack intro animation that can be played whenever you start combat and go into the plan state. Day 78, I finished up this entering battle animation, and in it you whip out your sword, and it looks kinda bad. But I moved on because around this time I decided to properly plan out a big system that I've been thinking about for a while. I want there to be a job system where you can spec your 3 party members into different jobs with different skills and weapons. And I'm taking heavy inspiration from the Final Fantasy Tactics games in this aspect, as in those 2 games you can mix 2 job sets of skills together to create interesting cross jobs. You can also get a lot of control over what skills and stats your characters get over time as you level them up. So I'm planning on making a similar system. Still ironing out the details, but one big thing is that I decided to plan out how acts would work. Now there are a few categories of acts, which I'm calling skills now by the way. Plan state skills, which are the same as the old acts, passive skills, which gives you passive abilities, charge skills, which you can use in combat, and ultimate skills, which are what I'm going to rework weapon techniques into. And instead of being tied to each weapon, these ultimate skills will be tied to individual classes, which should mean that I don't have to make as many of them, as they do take forever to make. And I can also make them pretty unique. And I can also tie them more easily to the class's strengths. Day 79, I finally finished Yuri's 8-direction movement animation and set up a system for pausing combat which will be necessary for the katana weapon technique, which I'm now going to call the ninja ultimate skill. Day 80, I got to polishing this ultimate skill, adding charging particles to the player. And the next day, I added a particle effect whenever you dash through an enemy during this charging state. Then I set up some camera movement, where the camera moves to the center of the battle zone whenever you finish charging, and combat also pauses for a few seconds. I also set up a darkness effect that only applies to the background and not to the player or enemies. And then I made some pixel art for some animations of the ultimate skill. Day 82, I set up the ultimate skill animations in-game and also added slashes to appear on all the enemies during the animation. And I continued the slashing animation into the next day, fixing bugs. Plus I also improved the Dapper Snapper sprite slightly, mostly just improving the shading on the bottom of it and on the arms. Day 84, I added a system for stunning fighters. Once again, this will be used by the ninja's ultimate skill. Day 85, I went back and fixed a bunch of bugs with entering and exiting combat, and also brought back the player's hit flash whenever he gets hurt, because I messed it up at some point. And I also added a little flash whenever your dash recharges, and that better communicates this. And I also decided to give the destructible objects another go. This time, instead of particles, I used 2D rigid bodies, so it's probably slightly worse for performance, but it looks 10 times better and is actually very satisfying now. I decided that it was way past time to start on some pathfinding, so on day 86, I brought an A-star pathfinding project again. And day 87, I started my experiments with pathfinding. First off, I just made a dot follow the player. Then I went in and properly made my own custom pathfinding movement script for the fighter controller that integrates with the rest of the fighter control systems for attacking and stuff. And yeah, now pathfinding pretty much works perfectly. That was easier than I expected. And on day 88, I decided to go out on a limb a bit and took a risk. I decided to go all in with my idea of mixing HG UI with pixel art. Games like Celeste have done it beautifully in the past, and I also took some inspiration from the manga panel style of Persona 5's UI. So I spent the day drawing up the sword unsheathing thing. It's far from perfect, and I'm not the best at this whole digital art thing, especially inking the lines and drawing the hands. But hopefully it'll look good in game. Day 89, I got the UI in the game and working, and it actually looks pretty great in my opinion. I'm really happy with it now, and the ultimate skill just needs a little bit more polish, and then I can finally be done with it. I finished up the day by just fixing some bugs with pathfinding and the fighter animations. So day 90, I basically just did a ton of polish to finish off the ultimate skill, with screen shake, better camera work, and stuff like that, and I eventually ended up with this, which I am super happy with. I decided to have some fun on day 91. Haha, that rhymed. And I'm going to quickly throw together some new weapons. First off, some guns. I had to set up ammo, reloading, and spread systems, but after that I made a pistol and shotgun for Yuri, and I also made a big hammer. The big hammer is for Liam, and it attacks slow and only deals okay damage, but it has huge knockback, and if you manage to make this enemy knockback and slam into a wall or another enemy, then it will take extra damage. And yeah, the hammer is probably my favorite weapon in the game right now. And on day 92, I decided to once again make some big reworks to the battle system. Basically, I decided to get rid of the intro animation to make transitioning between battle and peace more smooth. And I also decided to make it so that in some of the battle zones, enemies are instantly aggroed against you whenever you enter. I think that I can use this to create a few more interesting combat encounters, sort of inspired by Breath of the Wild, where you are incentivized to use the environment around you to your advantage when fighting enemies, and also to sneak up and take on enemies one at a time. I just think it could add a little bit more depth to some combat encounters. Day 93, I made it so you can now attack in peace states, but if you don't for a while, you'll holster your weapon. This is the other idea I have for combat. Neutral zones. Basically, these will be the majority of the overworld between things like dungeons, battle zones, and towns, and in these neutral zones, there'll be non-aggressive enemies which you can just walk past, but you can also attack them in order to grind or just because you're a menace, and they will aggro on you. So to set up these neutral zones, I made it so that whenever you hurt a passive enemy in one of these zones, it aggroes on you and enters combat. And I started day 94 with a bit of brainstorming. Basically, I put together a big table on Milanote of the job ideas I have for Liam. But more importantly, I decided to make one big change to the combat in the game. I added active abilities which you can use in combat, which are dependent on your current job. These are just an upgrade for the charge skills that I mentioned earlier, and I'm just going to call them combat skills from now on. These are sort of inspired by Risk of Rain 2 and basically should serve to give you more meaningful choices in combat, making different jobs more distinct from one another and making attacking a little bit more interesting than just holding down the attack button and aiming at enemies. But after that planning, I got into development. I finished up neutral zones. Now attacking an enemy also aggroes nearby enemies, and also peaceful enemies now have some idle movement. They just kind of pace around randomly. And on day 95, I finally made some new art for the battle zone walls. And I also fixed some bugs of the new idle movement that were causing the game to freeze. And while I was at it, I also fixed a bug with the bow's position getting messed up whenever you switch to and from a sword. I then animated some reloads for the pistol and shotgun. On day 96, I started on the new battle skill system, just setting up the general controller for the system, and then I decided to make some abilities to test it all out. I started with the ones for the ninja job, because I had already planned them out, and also Liam has a katana. Might as well do the ninja class. The first ability is a shuriken that you throw out that bounces between nearby enemies if you hit one. It's very inspired by the Huntress from Risk of Rain 2, who has an ability very similar to this one. This combat skill also requires a bit of skill, unfunny pun intended, because in order to maximize damage, you need to throw it when 2 or more enemies of similar health levels are nearby each other, which just adds a little bit of extra decision making that I want in the combat section of the game. Day 97, while working on the shuriken, I accidentally went back and overhauled the projectile system for all instances, as I was once again repeating code a bunch, and this new system is much better and cleaner. But I got the shuriken to work and set up a real sprite, added a trail, and made it spin. Getting close to the end of 100 days here at day 98, so I decided to finish the combat skills this day. First off, some UI to show your equip skills and their cooldowns. Then I made a camouflage skill, which is the utility skill of the ninja. It basically just turns you invisible, which makes enemies stop attacking and moving and lets you reposition. Also, if you get hit during this state, then you actually dodge it and leave the stealth state, so it's very useful for avoiding difficult attacks. I got this all set up and the camouflage isn't as useful as I thought it'd be, and it's actually kind of boring with normal enemies. But maybe it'll be a more useful skill when fighting something a bit more dangerous, which makes you reposition more. Or maybe you'll have to rework it into something new entirely, but I guess I'll just have to wait and find out. On day 99, I decided to try out this cool Unity asset store package that I'd acquired a while before. Basically, it's a more advanced 2D lighting system than the one that's in Unity by default. I messed around with it for a while, and I was kind of hoping that I'd be able to somewhat emulate the 3D look that I'd been messing around with a while ago. While I got some basic shadows, it wasn't nearly what I was hoping for. However, I was able to find some great examples of the usage of the system online, especially in this game called Dwarf, so I'm gonna keep working on it. So then I decided to make a dialogue system. It was actually pretty simple to make this, as I don't plan on having any branching choices or anything. I just set up a system of scriptable objects with characters and conversations and then the UI. I also made a separate simple system that I'd been needing in my game for a while, which is just a base for interactable objects. Basically just something that you can walk up to, press a button, and it'll trigger a Unity event, in this case dialogue. So this all works fine and was super simple to get working. And finally, it's day 100. And on this last day, I set it up so the enemies spawn randomly in the neutral zones. And then I focused on fixing some bugs. Specifically, I stopped enemies from moving during dialogue, and I finally got rid of an old bug where you could dash into walls by just changing a single option on the player's rigid body 2D. Finally, I made a wave system for battle zones. Now there can be lots of waves of enemies that you have to defeat. And with the system, I can just set up these waves in the editor, and then it'll go through each wave with little pauses and indicators to show where enemies will spawn before they spawn. It's pretty basic and I'll polish it up later, but it works well. And that's it. That was 100 days of indie game development spread out over the course of around 1.5 years. But now that this is my main project, development has sped up significantly, and I've been posting big updates in the forums of devlogs for a few months now. So if you are interested in following this game as I continue to develop it, likely for many more years, then subscribe and check out the devlogs I already have on Project Seaborn, as I talk a lot more about my plans for the future of the game and game design hurdles that I had to overcome while making this project. I hope you like this style of video, as I was kind of inspired by Minecraft YouTubers who have been doing videos in a style like this for a long time. And I figured that it would be interesting to make this video, but covering the development of my game over 100 real days. I'd love to do more videos like this in the future, but since it actually takes at least 100 real days of work to make something like this, it'll probably take a while. But thanks for watching, and be sure to check out one of these videos on the end screen, as I've heard that they're pretty cool. Bye.